Dr. David Wagshaw graduated from St. Vladimir Seminary with a Master of Divinity degree in 2002. He then worked for 2 years for the Department of External Affairs and Ecumenical Relations of the Orthodox Church in America. During that time, he represented the OCA on the governing board of the Canadian Council of Churches. In 2010, he completed his doctorate on the early development of Byzantine canon law at the University of Durham in England under the supervision of Professor Andrew Love. From 2010 to 2012, he taught at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. Now back in Canada, he teaches here at Trinity in the Orthodox Studies program, while pursuing numerous research projects. His current research interests include Byzantine canon law, but also early medieval church history and inter-Christian relations. His book on canon law as exegetical rhetoric is forthcoming.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we are rather late in our schedule. We're all okay, we're all right, but I will attempt to abbreviate a little bit here as I'm going on. My topic today is canon law in the Post-Constantinian. From a church historical perspective, the principal long-term legacy, of course, of Constantine was the establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. This was a process that begins with Constantine's conversion in approximately 312, and it was completed by the end of the century when Christianity would become, by law, first the privileged, and then an official religion, and then the official religion of the Roman Empire, in effect the exclusive privileged religion. Now, this establishment of Christianity, this deep intertwining of Christianity with the social, political, and cultural life of the empire, is one of the epochal events of church history. It's also one of the most controversial. It marks the beginning of what we can term the imperial synthesis. Over the next 3 centuries or so, we're going to see a tremendously powerful and rich set of developments in almost all aspects of Christian life, theologically, artistically, socially, demographically, structurally, and so on. What will emerge will more or less define what we will consider the basic form or shape of mainstream Christianity to this day. Classic Trinitarian theology emerges at this point. Classic monastic theology, the threefold order of the ministries are really firmly established. All the institutions, synod, the ecumenical council, and so forth. Many of the fundamental genres of Christian literature emerge at this point, and often they're sort of definitive exemplars. There's many standard liturgical, artistic, architectural forms of this period. Now, of course, many of these developments have their roots in the pre-Constantinian period. Many have very deep roots, of course, before that time. But it's now that we see their great flourishing. It's now that they take on their definitive form. And this synthesis that we're going to see between about the 4th century and the 6th century particularly will be tremendously successful. I mean, it's the great sort of success story of Christian history, as it were. Basically, from a purely historical perspective, all modern churches, all modern Christians, basically descend from this synthesis, from this church. There's a few exceptions, but a few. Now, the importance of this late antique imperial synthesis is such that I think today it's probably fair to say that almost all churches, albeit in very different ways, are engaged in an almost constant process of assessing this legacy and renegotiating the relationship with it. Today, I think this process for many churches is taking on a new urgency, if simply because the socio-political aspects of this legacy, the reality of the established church, of Christendom, in its many different versions, is now really under immense strain. And that's putting it mildly. In fact, it's probably actually collapsing before our very eyes, at least the socio-political reality of this. Even in my lifetime, I've seen a big difference. Now, for the Orthodox, as for all churches that cultivate a very strong sense of continuity with this imperial past, the issue of how we relate to this synthesis in now very changed circumstances is becoming really quite acute, and this symposium is witness to this. Now, this process of negotiation and assessment, because of our very direct, the Orthodox Church in many ways lives out of the late antique text world and thought world more directly and more immediately than any other church does. Because of that, this negotiation is very near the surface for us, I think, today. And it's a very tricky negotiation. It's basically a process of constantly encountering and confronting many dissonances or discords between our world and the world of this tradition, and then trying to figure out what to do with them. When are they problems? When are they sources of strength, and how? Well, a perfect test case to examine this negotiation with this past is really church law. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason is that our church law is very much a creature of late antiquity. I'll spare you a long history of the development of Orthodox church law, but suffice to say, the universal corpus of canons that is now recognized by all Orthodox churches basically took shape between the 4th and 9th century, and its really key structures and concepts were actually mostly in place between the 4th and the 6th century. You have later developments, they're very important developments, but in the Orthodox Church, these later developments tend to phrase themselves as interpretations, expansions on this earlier core material. What we don't get in the Orthodox tradition is any process of systematic rehauling in the later period or the modern period, a recodification that replaces that older tradition. So we actually do law out of late antique texts. And in this, incidentally, we're almost unique, I think, among major organizations or bodies of any type now in the Western world, of actually using as our living law, or trying to use as our living law, a pre-modern system. That we are now almost unique in that. 100 years ago, there was a lot of others doing that, but now that's pretty much us. So that's one reason why it's a good example. The second reason is because it's so practical. It touches, canon law touches the very structures, the behaviors, the politics of our churches, things that are very tangible for us, obvious us. So the points of dissonance are often very near to the surface. Now, when you start to engage with our tradition of canon law, it doesn't take long to find some points of dissonance. But here I must note that the things that people usually find sort of disconcerting about the canons, which are usually obsolete aspects of substantive regulation, that is, of the contents of specific rules, are probably not where the real challenges lie. It's true that the canons do have topics that seem very strange today. There are canons that legislate on hairdos. Canons of really almost bizarrely specific issues. Who's the metropolitan of Mauritania in North Africa? Sometimes, perhaps a little more offensively, we have canons forbidding, for example, visits to Jewish doctors, which seems rather odd today. Or canons that address social situations that are, of course, long dead, such as slavery. And of course, it's not too difficult to find points of apparent contradiction, repetition, or lack of clarity. But truthfully, those type of problems, from a sort of legal theoretical perspective, are not particularly surprising or particularly grave. Many legal systems have strange regulations, bizarre regulations, old regulations. All legal systems have problems of repetition and contradiction and so forth. These are all really quite routine issues, routine problems. And the Byzantine canonical tradition, like every other legal tradition, has resources for dealing with them in numerous different ways. The real dissonances, I would submit to you, are not actually so much on specific odd rules or one or two contradictions. Instead, they're subtler. And they arise on the level of what I would call legal culture. And this is where things start to get more difficult. Now, by legal culture, I mean the whole set of socio-cultural beliefs that any given legal system assumes for its functioning and for its operation, and the legal system also itself promotes. These are the values, the metaphysical narratives, the ideas of justice, the right, the place of rules in society, the fundamental social assumptions, cultural assumptions that surround the bare bones of the written laws themselves, that give them flesh, as it were. Now, the importance of legal culture for the effective functioning of any legal system, of course, cannot be overstated. It tends to become clearest when one attempts to transplant a legal system, say, let's say, a constitutional framework, or codification from one culture into another. We've done this very frequently in the last few centuries, particularly, for example, when we move a Western legal system into, let's say, an Asian context, a Middle Eastern context, an African context, and so forth. Very frequently, it doesn't go that well, or at least not quite as we expect. It doesn't tend to work so well, or not as we expect, because, of course, the legal system, these Western legal systems, assume all sorts of narratives that have built up, value narratives that have built up for generations in these Western contexts, that may not be there elsewhere. For example, the Western system often assumes that one should have their own opinion, independent political opinion apart from others, and that you should vote according to that opinion, that you should express that opinion, that you should be happy that you have a different opinion. That's just taken for granted. But in other cultures, of course, that's almost obscene. You don't do that. You don't vote according to your opinion, you vote according to with the tribe. You vote according to what the headman tells you to do. That's the socially acceptable thing to do. Different culture. In the West, we assume that it's perfectly acceptable, expected, and even laudable to openly criticize leaders, to even mock them, to make fun of them. It's expected, and they're expected to understand that that's going to happen. Right? We cultivate a culture of critique. But in many other societies, particularly with sort of very strong honor, shame type societies, this can be perceived as deeply subversive, as impudent, as insulting. Critique is generally kept hidden. It's around sort of the bend, as it were, underneath a constant sort of image of unity and harmony. In the West, we generally downplay and denigrate shows of power, and we expect leaders to understand this and play along with this, right? If you think about American presidents, they're almost always trying to outdo each other in folksiness, right? It's not instead putting on grand splendor and so on. Elsewhere, of course, this is not true. Rulers are expected and required to cultivate an aura of power, splendor, distance, and so on. So you have maybe these are just a couple examples. We could give other examples. The way that cultures look at rules, whether or not how rules are enforced, the extent to which cultures think institutions are important versus personal networks, and so on and so forth. Right, the point is, Western constitutional and legal systems depend upon these Western value sets to function. And when you parachute them elsewhere, that doesn't always work. Well, and so with late antique law. Orthodox canon law is basically a late antique law, and it assumes a late antique value set. Right, as I said, this is where we start to encounter problems. The problem is, in fact, compounded because Orthodox canon law, as a canonical system, happens to be a type of legal system that is particularly dependent upon external values, upon legal culture for its very operation, much more so than our modern Western legal system, Western systems. This actually relates to what is the first real point of dissonance between our legal culture and late antique culture. Our very understanding of what a legal system is and how it's supposed to work. Today, we tend to think of law as an extensive, rational set of rules that is to be applied with absolute, virtually mechanistic consistency and logic to almost any fact situation, that's comprehensive, virtually gapless, that's operated by largely autonomous, professionalized, highly specialized cadre of officials, in which there's a distinct difference between morality and legality, between people's personal beliefs and legal officials and what their beliefs are, that has a complex jurisprudence that's highly constructible and reconstructible, easily changed. Well, you don't have to work with canonical texts for long to realize that this is not what's going on in the late antique Orthodox canonical legal system. The Orthodox canonical tradition is far from a huge, systematically rationalized, comprehensive rule system. It's instead very compact. It has tons of gaps. It has a very limited place for jurisprudence. It has almost no patterns of real professional legal professionalization until the modern period. It's very sacralized and ossified. It resists profound system-wide change. It's profoundly and intentionally impermeated by morality and values, and expects its judges and its disputants to be also. Its overarching metaphor is perhaps not so much mechanistic and technological as rhetorical and literary. By modern standards, in fact, it's almost hardly a legal system at all. It's almost somewhere sort of between a moral system and a legal system. Well, there's many aspects of this that are rather nice, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in practice, this can become very problematic. We're accustomed to a very regular, predictable, consistent legal experience, one that's basically driven by consistent application of a carefully defined body of rules. Well, there's plenty of rules in Orthodox canon law, and there's a considerable degree of consistency as well. But broadly, there's a much greater place for discretion in Orthodox canon law. And it's much, much easier. In fact, it's encouraged and required for extra legal values and rules to be brought into any formal dispute resolution process. Actually, they often have to be brought into play precisely because the system is so small and in a sense, simple. When the system finds something it's not addressed by some rule, it requires you to look outside of itself, go outside of the legal system to find solutions. So what this means in sort of layperson's term is that dispute resolution in Orthodox canon law tends to be much more, quote-unquote, commonsensical than we're accustomed to in our modern legal systems. And this is precisely what's going on with the famous notion of oikonomia in Orthodox canon law, which is basically the equity or discretionary principle in Orthodox canon law. Nothing unusual about having an equity principle, but what is unusual is that Orthodox canon law gives a very, very wide range of play to economia. Well, what all of this means is that most people will experience Orthodox canon law as a much looser, more informal, much less technical, much less consistent, and regular legal experience than we're accustomed to. This is in itself quite alarming often for people when they experience this. But that's actually not what I want to talk about. The real point I want to make here is, again, that for my present purpose, that Orthodox canon law is much more dependent upon these outside values. It's much more deeply embedded, as it were, and dependent upon a shared legal culture. So let's look at what some of these values are of this ancient legal culture. Again, here it doesn't take long to find some dissonances. Some are of a similar order of the problems of the sort of isolated odd canons I mentioned earlier. These are discourses which are, the canonical system assumes discourses that are either extinct today, or often considered offensive, or simply not understood. You could see many of these in Orthodox canon law. The best example is probably the discourse of purity, particularly blood purity, which is assumed all over the place in our canonical tradition. I think people today simply don't get it. I mean, they can explain it to themselves and so on, but it's not a natural part of our society to talk in terms of purity, for example. There are many others. These type of problems, again, though, generally speaking, still pertain to the actual content of canonical legislation itself, and as such, they're not perhaps more problematic in the long term than the occasional isolated, obsolete, or controverted canon. The true problems emerge with cultural assumptions that pertain more directly to the very functioning of Orthodox canon law as a legal system. That is, assumptions that are built into the very structure of Orthodox canon law as a law. Right. Now, one of the things that laws tend to do is to define and describe, and in particular control or restrain power. This is where we start to get into some problems. First of all, the canons assume in their description and construction of power the idea that society is fundamentally and naturally stratified, right? In other words, the canons assume a class system, which is something we simply no longer experience today. Even 100 years ago, we did. They assume a society, including church polity, that can only function properly as a fairly strictly defined hierarchical system, in which everyone has a fairly defined and stable place, each with its own duties and rights. It assumes a whole elaborate set of ritualizations of this system, symbolics of a class system with patterns of mannerism, formal signs of deference, complex titles, differences of dress, and so on and so forth. It assumes a very vertical pattern of obedience. It consumes all sorts of details in ordering. And behind all of it, there's even a more complex metaphysic, which sees this social or political stratification as directly reflecting and even realizing a much broader cosmic hierarchical ordering, and an ordering of the human person, a psychological hierarchical ordering. All of reality is conceived as this kind of hierarchical stratified reality. Now, all of this is actually pretty normal, almost run-of-the-mill, I would say, for class-based societies. The problem is this whole view of reality and the cosmos and the self and of social ordering is basically dead today in Western society, both as an ideal and increasingly as a reality, and particularly in its symbolic representation. It's mostly gone. And where it persists, it tends to be frowned upon or sort of tolerated in our society as long as it's perceived as sort of harmless or quaint. But reality is we simply don't have an aristocracy. We don't have nobility anymore. It's gone. If anything, we tend to privilege the opposite. We privilege a grammar of social equalization. So this creates a very serious dissonance, the result of which is our churches, loyal to the canonical tradition, and actually spent a tremendous amount of energy in continuing, and in fact, we're almost a sort of one of the very few last outposts in our society where we continue this very archaic grammar of power. When you enter into the Orthodox churches, you enter into a kind of time warp in this respect. And it's interesting, converts sort of have to learn how to work now in this sort of aristocratic social stylization, structuralization. It takes them some time to learn that language. Now, you can argue that this is good or bad, that it's worth preserving or not, but I will observe one thing, is that it has in fact created a very new experience of church. What I mean by this is that even 150 years ago, this class-based aristocratic structuring of power would have been an entirely normal experience for virtually everybody, particularly in Eastern Europe. The church would not have been experienced as unusual in this respect, right? You would be doing all those sort of forms of deference and so on and so forth, and titles and rules and structures. You'd experience that all the time, everywhere in your life. Now, you only experience that when you cross the threshold of a church. So that's a totally new experience. That's something that's quite new. So you need to think about that. So the definition and description of a power assumed by the canons is very different from what we assume today in our society. Well, an even more serious and practical dissonance, however, may be in the area of control or restraint of power in the canons. What we might call the checks and balances in the canonical system. This is a very big issue today in our Orthodox churches. The problem is that when you look at the canons as simply a body of rules, just those bones, right, without that culture, there's relatively few checks and balances of the type we would recognize today on clerical and particularly episcopal power. Instead, power is overwhelmingly invested in the hands of the bishops. Bishops are supposed to be accountable to each other in synod, but that's about it. Collectively, the authority the bishops have is virtually total, and there is almost no recourse, constitutional recourse, over and against the power of the synod. And also there's no separation of powers. Right? The bishops are the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, all rolled into one. And their financial authority, canonically, is also pretty much complete, total, with a few limits. So collectively, the bishops are virtually autocratic in their authority. And this is exactly what we should expect from a late antique legal system. That's no surprise. Well, actually, there are more checks and balances in the system that first meet the eye. The problem is they're not really of a constitutional character. They're cultural, or sort of socio-cultural. Read the canons. One thing you'll notice is they're very interested in appearances, how things look. This is a fairly regular concern. Canons will talk forbidding bathing because this will cause reproach among the pagans, people who are seeing it. Right? The canonical order will be defined in terms of slander or gaining praise before others. This is interesting because it reflects an important social reality. The canons assume a relatively small-scale polity in which pretty much everyone knows everyone. Right? Like a small town today. Everyone knows the priest, everyone knows the bishop's family on. Everyone's living fairly cheap and jowl. So this assumes a very high degree of social scrutiny of what's going on. It's more informal social scrutiny. So it's a kind of check and balance. More strikingly, the canons are constantly concerned, to a point that's really very odd by modern legal standards, with moral and internal dispositions. The canons do not just address the what of behavior, but the how. So the canons are constantly noting how bad behavior stems from shamelessness, greed, insolence, and so forth. The canonical task itself is defined in very moral terms. Canons are to guide to a pious way of life, and so forth. The canons are constantly talking on the level of morality, virtue, and vice. Similar, in a way that is also very odd, the canons are didactic in character. They're preaching, right? They teach constantly. They don't just state rules, they give explanations. They draw out consequences. They cite examples. Some canons are virtually mini sermons. I'll go with Chulo 96 as an excellent example. Well, these examples are very interesting. It is, again, more or less what we'd expect in late antique society, because just briefly, running out of time a bit, but briefly, late antique society was much, much more invested in doing social control through the formation of the person instead of the construction of institutions and institutional guards. For example, there's actually very little real public Roman law in existence. The vast majority of Roman law is private. It's about financial transactions. Right? How do you control the emperor? How is the emperor's authority controlled? There's a huge literature of mirrors of princes, which give extremely detailed descriptions of the emperor's behavior, his disposition, how he walks, how he looks, do you smile a certain way to friends, do you not smile a certain way to friends, and so on. So very detailed portrait drawings, as it were, painting an image of who the emperor is supposed to be on the level of behavior and morality, basically. So that sort of takes its place. Well, the canons are doing something very similar. Perhaps the most important check and balance, however, which I'll close, emerges from another very important aspect of the canonical tradition, one that often makes modern commentators a little nervous, but it's really important for the system's functioning. And that's that the canons are deeply sacralized. The whole tradition is cast as holy. The canons are divine and sacred. They originate from the Spirit. They are likened to Scripture, sometimes very directly. Their scope is broad, even salvific. Time and time again, we learn that God himself is interested in canonical order. He participates in it. I could give numerous examples of that. Well, this is important because it means if you violate the canons, you're not simply violating some human rule, right? you're violating a divine rule. You're violating God's rules. So as long as you believe that, and that's the key, this gives the rule a kind of charge, a kind of weight, a power that modern secular systems don't really have. God himself is watching, right? So you might get away with it now, but you're not ultimately going to get away with it. What this means is that, from sort of a sociological perspective, the whole system is really trying to work on the level of conscience in a way that we don't think of legal systems doing today. Almost on the level of guilt, as it were. They're trying to work through internalized moral controls. Now, by today's standards, I think such checks and balances seem a bit weak and maybe even naive. I think in their own context they weren't. But the problem is, what happens when you take that world, take those legal rules, and stick them into our notion of what a legal system is, right? This is where we can start to have all sorts of problems. We now live in a legal universe in which law broadly becomes a kind of relatively amoral, cynical, very human, agonistic rule game. It's like a game. It's a game of rules, which plays out as a kind of formalized contest among competing interests. What others believe is not that important. Law actually has little business prying into your motives, your dispositions, your belief. And certainly today, law is not divine. We tend to think of it as the most human of inventions today. Right. So, you take this concept of law, and then wrap it around this rather older, on the face of it, extremely sort of autocratic system, and the potentials for problems are actually immense. Because what we've done, in a sense, is remove those legal, cultural checks that are meant to be there. So, what did we do? There's maybe two ways we can go. We can, one, attempt to try to recreate or revivify, in fact, this ancient world, this ancient legal culture, as much as is possible. In effect, try to shape our world to the canons. Or we can try to root and branch, update our legal system to better fit modern realities. In effect, reshaping the canonical tradition to the realities of our world, of our own cultural imaginations, of our own legal imaginations. I suspect there's problems both ways, and I suspect the future will have to include some elements of both. But I will close by noting that despite these many problems, to end on sort of a positive note, there are many aspects of this ancient system, precisely as an ancient system that is rather different and foreign to us, that are extremely interesting, and I think extremely valuable, and that we should be very, very leery about losing too quickly. One of the cliches about orthodoxy is that it's not very legalistic. This is very appealing to people today, and I think rightly so. Now, if it's taken to mean that we don't have rules, that we don't have standards, that we don't have disciplines, that it's all just sort of chaos, this is absolute nonsense. No, we do have a law in the Orthodox Church. It's quite established, it's quite sophisticated in its own way. But if it does mean that we understand that law is not simply a kind of cool, cold, sort of rule machine almost, sort of, that's unleashed upon people, but it works with and speaks to the reality of the whole person, that it's therapeutic and not retributive in character, that its horizons open unto salvation itself, that it operates, as all late ancient laws do, with eyes wide open, not with a blindfold. That's an early modern image of justice. Ancient laws have, your eyes are supposed to be wide open so you see a full reality. If we think of the church legal system as trying to believe and trying to serve the gospel, then if we're, this is what it means not to be legalistic, then that's quite accurate, I think, for the Orthodox tradition. I think that is what the Orthodox canonical system is trying to do. And as such, it's a very important witness to what Christian law can and should be.